Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Preservation School class about the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Our 2022-2023 Preservation School series is featuring classes with representatives from New York City's agencies. You can learn about these agencies' missions and how they engage with historical neighborhoods, buildings, and sites. We hope you will join us for the entire series. Our next class discussing the municipal archives will be on November 9th. Additional classes on other city agencies will be announced soon. Tonight will also be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel for free viewing. In addition to Preservation School, we have 6 to Celebrate tours coming up. An in-person Woodlawn Cemetery tour is on Saturday, October 15th, and a virtual tour of the abandoned Staten Island cemeteries is on Wednesday, October 19th. Please check out our website, hdc.org, for information and to sign up. You may also watch all of our previous Preservation School classes and virtual tours on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions about programming, you can contact me at marvulu@hdc.org. I would also like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting Preservation School. Now I will hand it over to Michael Sandler, HPD Assistant Commissioner for Neighborhood Development and Stabilization, to lead tonight's class. Thank you. Michael.
Thank you, Michelle, and great seeing everyone's, names in the chat. Hopefully we'll be joined by a few more folks as well. Sorry about the issues with the link. As Michelle said, my name is Michael Sandler. I'm an Assistant Commissioner at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And tonight's presentation, I think, might be a little different than other preservation school classes, because I'm not going to talk specifically about any historic preservation tools, but I will talk generally about what it is that we do here at HPD and about generally what's up with housing in New York City. Let me figure out how to move my slides. The agenda for tonight, we'll talk about New York City's housing crises, go through in turn 5 different housing crises facing New York City right now, talk about how HPD addresses those crises, and if we have time or if folks want to chat about it, we'll go through a little bit more content on what is affordable housing. I'll have some slides in the appendix if folks want to visit those during the discussion. And yeah, hopefully we'll have some time for questions as we go through. And feel free to, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. I think folks might have the ability to do that. And if I see them, maybe I can answer them as we go. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about 5 distinct but overlapping crises. They're all separate crises, but they impact each other and shape each other. So the first, and I'm going to talk about them quickly now, and then I'll go through each one in turn. So the first is low incomes. Families that have the lowest incomes just cannot afford rents that support the cost of operating a building. What that means is that either people are paying way more than they can afford in rent, or they are experiencing homelessness as a result of the fact that they can't do that, or that housing quality deteriorates because the rent that's coming in from a building isn't maintaining that building. We also have an extremely limited supply of housing. In the last 20 years, the New York City region has added only 1 housing unit for every 3 new jobs that it has added. So all those people that are coming here for those new jobs that it didn't exist before are not finding additional housing. And so we're sort of all competing for the few available apartments, driving up the price of those apartments. And even moderate income households have difficulty finding affordable housing. I think anyone that has looked for housing in the last year knows firsthand just how bad this shortage is. You have folks coming to view, kind of crappy apartments that cost too much, and there's 50 other people there trying to put in an application at the same time. We also have segregated and unequal neighborhoods. New York City is the most diverse city in the United States, but discrimination and segregation in our neighborhoods persist. Our segregated neighborhoods are rooted in a history of racist laws, policies, and practices. And there are clear connections between a New Yorker's race, where they live, and their access to opportunity. We'll talk more about this as we go through. Another crisis is homelessness. Each night, there are over 60,000 people sleeping in the city's shelter system, including 20,000 children. The high cost of housing is one of the primary causes of homelessness in New York City. And we have underinvestment in public housing. NYCHA, New York City's Public Housing Authority, supplies 8% of the city's rental housing stock. And of that housing stock, those 175,000 apartments, NYCHA comprises nearly 80% of the apartments in New York City with rents that are less than $500 a month. But for decades, federal housing subsidies have favored middle-class home ownership over public housing, leaving NYCHA with over $40 billion in capital repair. So digging in a little bit more on what I said before about how the lowest income families don't earn enough to support rent that supports the cost of operating a building. So 1 in 4 households in New York City earn less than $30,000. So if a household is spending no more than 1/3 of their income on rent, that means that the rent that household can afford should be less than $600. But the average cost to operate a multifamily apartment in New York City is over $1,000 a month. And that $1,000 a month includes taxes, labor, like the super, any maintenance that's needed, the utilities, heating, fuel, insurance. It doesn't include like a loan, like if they've used a loan to buy the building or build the building, that's actually not included in this cost. So this is just $1,000 a month just to keep the lights on of the building. So that means there's a big gap there between that $600 and that $1,000. There's a $400 gap between what 1 in 4 households can afford and what it costs to maintain a building. And so if that gap isn't met somehow, either folks are paying less rent, but the building isn't bringing in enough money to maintain its building systems, and folks are living in low quality, unsafe housing, which has really negative impacts on people's life outcomes, or they're paying more than what they can afford, and that also has really negative impacts on people's lives. So preventing severe rent burden, homelessness, or unsafe housing requires some sort of subsidy to make up that difference. And I think when people talk about affordable housing, that's really one of the roots there, is that there's these people that earn not enough money to afford a level of housing that we as a society have decided is what a kind of baseline standard of housing should be. This leads to really high rates of rent burden. The charts on this slide are kind of confusing, but they show a lot. So basically what this is showing is the levels of rent burden by income group, and rent burden generally means that a household is spending more than 1/3 of their income on rent. And severe rent burden means that they're spending more than half of their income on rent. So what you see from this chart is that low income households that earn less than $80,000 a year, have very high rates of rent burden. And in general, New Yorkers as a whole have really high rates of rent burden. So about about half of New Yorkers are rent burdened in some way, meaning they spend more than 1/3 of their income on rent. And about 1/3 of New Yorkers are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than half of their income on rent. But this is not even across income groups. You can see that low income households have much higher rates of rent burden, and extremely low income households that are earning less than $30,000 a year, you can see that very high rates of rent burden, but actually somewhat less rent burden overall as a population than the low income category, because many of them are living in means tested housing, like public housing, or they have a Section 8 voucher, meaning that their rent is based on their income. So they sort of de facto cannot be rent burdened. So moving on and talking about another crisis, are segregated and unequal neighborhoods. So New York City's neighborhoods have been shaped by a legacy of intentional policies and practices. Many New York City public housing developments, and as I said, public housing is about 8% of the New York City's rental stock, so it's a huge share, were once explicitly segregated by race. And other large-scale developments like Stuyvesant Town in Manhattan were reserved exclusively for white families. And the development of New York City also coincided, especially the development of the outer boroughs, coincided with a period where a practice called redlining was in effect. And redlining in its most simplest form was a policy supported by federal lending practices that basically meant that certain neighborhoods were off limit from private investment in housing. And those neighborhoods tended to be neighborhoods where people of color lived. And so that really, because New York City's outer boroughs were developed at that time, housing finance was only available during that time, essentially for segregated development. And so places like where I live in Jackson Heights or Forest Hills in Queens were once explicitly segregated by race, based on the financing terms that helped build those new neighborhoods, the outer boroughs. And I think a lot of folks like to think of, redlining and segregation as a thing of the past, but you see that the city's processes for changing zoning, approving new buildings, continues to be shaped by discrimination and the same types of forces that led to segregation. You see significant opposition to new affordable housing in some of the whiter, more suburban areas of New York City. Even today, there's recent controversies just this week about, supportive housing project in the Belmont area of the Bronx, for example. So this map is showing kind of what's the rub here in terms of our segregated neighborhoods. So this is what's called a dot density map. So each dot represents 100 New Yorkers of one of the 4 major racial and ethnic groups from the US Census. So the red dots represent, each red dot represents 100 people of Asian or Pacific Island descent. They make up about 14% of the city's population. Each green dot represents 100 Black households, individuals, 100 Black individuals. Black New Yorkers make up about 22% of the city. Each yellow dot is showing Hispanic New Yorkers, who make up about 30% of the city. And each blue dot shows 100 white households, who make up about a third of this. So you can see here that we got a lot of colors on the map here. New York City is one of the most diverse cities in the country, but you can see very clear, just with the naked eye, geographical clustering by race in New York City, with heavily Black and Hispanic populations in the Bronx. I don't know if folks can see my cursor here. Heavily Black areas in northern Manhattan, very white in much of lower Manhattan and southern Brooklyn and Staten Island, large concentrations of Black New Yorkers in central and east Brooklyn, and Asian New Yorkers in eastern Queens, lower Manhattan, and Brooklyn. So just because our neighborhoods have remained persistently segregated, I forgot which slide was next. So this slide shows both diversity and segregation in New York City's neighborhoods. Segregation is not experienced equally by all New Yorkers. New York City's children are much more segregated than New York City overall. So racial and ethnic segregation among public elementary students is especially stark. This map is showing percent of kindergarten through 5th grade students who are Black based on where they live. And you can see very clear, very firm lines. And so while adult New Yorkers may live in more diverse areas, children in New York are living in much more segregated communities and schools. And the fact that our neighborhoods remain segregated doesn't mean that they have not changed. I'm gonna really breeze through the next couple slides here. But this map is basically showing the percent change from 1990 to 2015-ish. And the darkest red areas are showing the areas where the share of the population that is white fell by 40 to 60%. And the darkest blue areas are showing the areas of the city where the share of the neighborhood that is white grew by 15 to 30%. So you see huge reductions in the white population in Queens and South Brooklyn, and major increases in downtown Brooklyn and Harlem. And I'll just breeze through. We have these maps for all of those 4 major racial and ethnic groups. So kind of the Black map is somewhat of the inverse of that white map, where shrinking Black population in downtown Brooklyn, growing Black population in Southeast Queens and South Brooklyn. And actually, I guess that was my last one about change. And then what are the impacts of this segregation? So where a person lives has major impacts on their life outcomes. And in East Harlem and many parts of the Bronx, children are up to 15% more likely to visit the emergency room because of asthma-related conditions as children who live on the Upper East Side or Greenwich Village. And so these segregated neighborhoods, these lack of options, have real impacts on people's lives. So I talked before about our limited supply of housing. This chart, as I said, we've had 3 new jobs for every 1 new housing unit in New York City. This chart is showing new housing controlled for population. So I think folks walk around New York and it really seems like there's construction everywhere. And part of that's probably actually just because of our scaffolding laws, which require scaffolding even on buildings that aren't really under construction. But New York actually produces much less housing even than other municipalities that are notorious for their lack of housing production, like San Francisco. And other areas, especially further left on this chart, places like Houston, Dallas, Denver, Seattle, Atlanta, that have produced a lot more housing per capita, are places that are much more affordable than New York City. This chart just shows housing production by decade. And I think that the important piece here is that just to look at kind of when the spikes are in this, and you see huge spikes in housing production in periods of New York City's history where our economy was booming. In the 1920s, it was the roaring 20s. Business on Wall Street was booming. And New York's economy was incredibly strong, and folks were moving out of rural areas and into cities. And the city responded by really building out much of the city that we know today. Over that decade, nearly 800 or over 700,000 new apartments during that time period. And a similar thing happened. We built, another 700,000 apartments in the 50s and 60s in that boom period after the World War. And in the 2000s, in 2000s and 2010s, similarly, but for a little blip after the 2008 recession, had a very booming economy despite some pretty big shocks here in New York, September 11th, and the fiscal crisis in 2008. But overall, the fundamentals of our economy were booming during that time period, with growth in the media, fashion, and the tech industry here in New York. But we did not build nearly as much housing over that 20-year period as we did in other periods of prosperity for New York City. And that really, I think, is much of the root of this crisis, where there just are not enough apartments to go around. So despite the limited housing production we have built in the last decade, 20,000 new housing units, and 200,000 new housing units, but that is not, equally spread throughout the city. It's very heavily concentrated in former non-residential areas that were rezoned to allow for housing, like Hudson Yards, West Chelsea, Long Island City, Greenpoint, and downtown Brooklyn on this map. Those are the darkest blue portions of the map. And there are also periods of the city over the last 10 years that actually have a net loss of housing. And most of those are within historic districts, including parts of the Upper East and West Sides, Greenwich Village, Dumbo, and Soho. And that's I think it's maybe green or orange on this map. I'm colorblind a little bit. And this map is just showing where new affordable housing construction has happened. So you see it's similarly concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And I'm not going to belabor this point. All right, so rounding out our housing crises, I talked about underinvestment in public housing. So New York City's housing authority, its aging infrastructure has been underfunded by the federal government for decades. And its 175,000 apartments now confront $40 billion in major capital repair needs, and that figure grows by $1 billion every year. Most of NYCHA's buildings are 50 to 80 years old and have gone many years without upgrades. And I think we're a historic preservation group. I think anyone that lives or has worked with older buildings knows that they need constant care and upgrades. NYCHA only receives about $500 million in annual federal capital funding. It's just a mere fraction of the need there. And so that is a major crisis that we have here in our housing. So I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit, which I think is kind of the second half of this presentation, about who is HPD, what do we do to address these crises. So My agency, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, is the largest municipal housing preservation and development agency in the nation. Our mission is to promote the quality and affordability of the city's housing and the diversity and strength of our city's neighborhoods. And we do this by maintaining building and resident safety and health, by creating opportunities for New Yorkers through housing affordability, and by engaging New Yorkers to build and sustain neighborhood strength and diversity. So one of the major ways that HPD addresses our housing crises is through preserving existing affordable housing. And when we say preserving, it's not exactly the historic preservation sense. It's a little bit of a broader meaning of that word. And what we mean is finance to safeguard the affordability of that housing stock, promoting safe and healthy housing, and supporting low-income homeowners. So we offer loans, tax incentives, and other resources to building owners in exchange for keeping their homes affordable. And we work to improve the stock of housing that has received those benefits while safeguarding those residents' tenancy, their rights, and their affordability. We promote safe and healthy housing. We have housing inspectors who enforce the housing maintenance code of the city of New York. Through 311, we contact property owners on behalf of tenants that need building repairs. And for buildings with hazardous violations, like a lack of heat or an unsecured front door that are not addressed by landlords, HPD may step in to perform frequent inspections and make emergency repairs ourselves to make sure that folks are living within a baseline standard of healthy housing. And we also work to support low-income homeowners. We provide affordable loans for home repairs to low-income homeowners of 1 to 4 family homes. And we also provide one-on-one support through housing counselors as part of HPD's Homeowner Help Desk, which we run in partnership with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. We also work along with sister agencies to protect tenants. So we offer tenant education and resources, educating tenants, particularly the elderly and non-English speakers, about their rights and resources to prevent displacement. And we provide free legal representation to tenants that are facing harassment, and collaborate with other agencies to support an online portal. It's a website, the Tenant Resource Portal. The city also offers a variety of resources for eviction prevention. There's a housing court navigation and also home-based prevention centers, as well as free legal assistance. And the city's Human Resources Administration offers one-shot deals, which are short-term emergency rental assistance, and tenant-based rental vouchers and credits. So that's funding to help support people's rents, basically, or rent freezes like the SCREE or DREE programs. And there's some other tools as well, like the Office of the Tenant Advocate at DOB, who is really tasked with making sure that combating construction harassment and other services for tenants that are facing discrimination, like the City Commission on Human Rights. We also work to create new affordable housing. We offer loans, tax incentives, and other public resources to facilitate the development of affordable housing. So since 2014, we're kind of a bank. We offer these loans, and in exchange for these loans, we require and regulate the rent in these buildings and the eligibility of who can move into them to make sure that they're affordable and available for low-income New Yorkers. So since 2014, we've financed the creation of a new 73,000 new affordable homes in New York City. We do this on private sites where owners partner with HPD to include affordable housing in the development of new housing, or on public sites where HPD owns land. We issue requests for proposals to identify a development team that will construct and manage that housing. We also implement the city's mandatory inclusionary housing program that requires affordable housing along with new housing growth. And we work in all this development work to support a diversity of types of owners, including groups like community land trusts and other nonprofit developers, as well as minority and women-owned business enterprises. And we work to plan for equitable growth. So many parts of New York City, predominantly communities of color, have zoning that hasn't changed since 1961. We work with the Department of City Planning on neighborhood plans and rezonings that allow for growth while protecting existing housing. bring new investments to improve the quality of life and access to opportunity. We also work in other neighborhoods that already have lots of amenities to implement, to allow for new housing, implement mandatory inclusionary housing to promote economic and racial diversity along with housing growth. And we're currently implementing the Where We Live NYC Fair Housing Plan, the city's comprehensive plan to confront segregation and take action to advance opportunity. This plan has a really wonderful section on the history of New York City's segregated neighborhoods. And so I think anyone interested in New York City's history, I encourage you to check it out. It's on our website, nyc.gov/wherewelive. And that's all my slides. I'm going to pause here. I could dig in a little bit more on what is affordable housing, but I'm going to pause on that and I think take some questions. I see one in the chat, and then I'm happy for folks to unmute themselves. So the question here was, how does HPD work with LPC? If someone applies for a loan or grant for work on a 1 to 4 family home that may also be landmarked, does HPD support mainly go to infrastructure upgrades, or can it be used for things like facade maintenance? So HPD's financing can be, so for 1 to 4 family homes, we would be working through a partner, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, who would work directly with that homeowner to apply for HPD's funding, and also to get, make sure that they're getting a reputable contractor and they're getting all the necessary permits that they need to do the work. And we wouldn't provide that funding until they've received all their necessary permits. So if the home were in a historic district, yes, they would need, depending on the scope of the work, they may need a certificate of appropriateness from LPC, and they may also be eligible for other benefits like tax credits or other resources specifically to address historic preservation. And so our partners would work with that homeowner to figure out, how can they fund this project, and then what is the need. So things like facade maintenance would potentially be eligible if there was a hazardous condition with the facade, or if that was needed as part of the building's maintenance. It certainly could be a piece. I think, our bread and butter on this program are things like kitchen rehab, new heating systems, new roof, things that are a little bit more time sensitive, though, a facade repair can be quite time sensitive and impactful for the health and the physical safety of that home. And a comment from John about the images of normal housing. I'm actually not sure which slide that was referring to. But any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or pop them in the chat. So I have a question about one housing unit for every 3 jobs. How is this figured? And do we assume that all jobs hire city residents? So actually that's a regional figure. So that's from the census, just about the number of people that are employed in the region. So it's both census figures for actually both census figures for the number of new jobs, and it's for the entire New York City region, and then administrative data on housing production is the corollary, and also is a regional figure. And so not all city residents, but we are in both a regional housing and a regional job market. So the failure to create new housing in Long Island also has an impact on the cost of housing here in the city. And yes, not every, some households have 2 earners, so two jobs may only need 1 housing unit is true, but it is still quite a big deficit. John Bacon asked about the size of our budget. It is quite large. I will see if I can dig it up. I do not know it off the top of my head, but we have both a capital budget, which funds the new construction. Excuse me. We have a capital budget. I think we have a $10 billion 10-year capital budget, which funds the construction of the housing itself. And then we have an operating budget that pays for all of our housing inspectors and our other staff. And I'll see if I can do a quick Google to find that. In the meantime, any other questions? Looks like our fiscal year 22 budget is, let me make sure I'm writing the right figure here. We have a $1 billion fiscal year 23 budget. And that includes our staffing as well as our capital budget. And Brendan asked about community land trusts and what phase of implementation we are in supporting CLTs. So we have been working with community land trusts for a number of years now. We had a request for expressions of interest about community land trusts, where we asked people to just tell us, like, what do they want to do with community land trusts? And that was in 2017. From that, we directly work with 3 CLTs who are interested in specific housing development projects. So one was the East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust, which is rehabilitating housing in East Harlem. And one was the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, and the third, who was similarly working on some rehab projects in the Lower East Side. And the third was the Interborough Land Trust, which is a citywide community land trust focused on small homes. We also supported through that a learning exchange where I think it was 12 other groups went through a 2-year educational process with the New York City Community Land Initiative to learn about community land trusts and to kind of do some visioning for their future. The city community land trusts are supported annually by a $1.5 million city council initiative, and we're working with a variety of community land trusts on specific affordable housing projects. All told, we're working to create about 1,000 units of housing on community land trusts over the next few years. So a very active pipeline of projects with community land trusts. Penelope asks if it costs $1,000 to maintain one apartment per month. Many apartments are renting for vastly more than that, while others lots less. Is it feasible to try to even out that disparity? That's a great question. Yeah, so I mean, one of the drivers of housing costs is just physically the cost of providing housing. So in new housing, for example, the rents have to be sufficiently high enough to cover the annual operating costs that would accrue after having built that building, which would involve a really big loan to build that building. And in old housing, the rents need to keep the lights on for that building to be financially, stable. But at the same time, in New York City, you see lots of apartments that go for $3,000 a month, and that's not a function of the cost of maintaining that, but it's a function of what people are willing to pay. And as I noted, there's really a lot of competition for the very limited housing units that we have, and that drives up cost. And the question of, is it feasible to try to even out that disparity? New York State has programs like rent stabilization that does cap rents, and that is sort of one way that the city does do that. So Victoria asks, should we be including real estate speculation as a reason for causing rising housing prices? Where I live, some folks are driving prices by paying $100,000 to $300,000 more than asked to buy properties. Often the owners are absentee and illegally subdivide without proper egress, creating many unsafe conditions. This has made every square foot of housing more expensive. Yes, so I think I would counter, or I would contend that speculative activity that you see is a function of the housing shortage. So the fact that folks think that housing will be even more valuable than it is now in a few years is because those folks are betting on the fact that we are not going to solve our city's housing crisis, and that we will continue to have fewer housing units than we have people that want housing units in the city. You definitely see people paying well above asking for sales of housing. You see both people asking well above housing that are speculators or seeking to rent out those housing units. But even in places like co-ops, you see people paying well above asking, because they know that there are other people, that were there with them on that home tour that are also going to be bidding on that home. And one of the things you've seen recently in the last year that I think I hadn't seen much before in New York City was renters that are paying above asking in order to get selected for a housing unit, and that's just how dire the crisis is. That said, I think that there's been a lot of research over the last decade on the financialization of the housing industry, and what it means for our country to have equity tied up in our homes, and the kind of professionalization of the landlord industry. And so I won't say that real estate speculation and financialization is beneficial to our housing in New York City. I think that is also an issue that exists. So that's a great point, Victoria. And HDC asks, has HPD thought about conversion of vacant office space due to the pandemic to housing, or is that more of a city planning / zoning conversation? So I'll say we have thought about it, and it also is a more of a city planning and zoning conversation, though I think it is both a housing finance question and a zoning question. I think one of the things that you see is that office buildings often don't make great housing, especially your larger floor plate Class A office buildings. They have really deep floor plates, and so to convert that into housing, you're either going to have really narrow apartments where each one has a little bit of window at the outside of the building, and then as you get towards that elevator core, no windows at all. And then you also have those buildings designed for kind of a different type of use. So it's very challenging. The state did pass a law allowing for the conversion of vacant office space and hotels. And I think over the years you've seen conversion of office space into housing in places like the financial district. Out my window here, there are former Class B office buildings, some of those older office buildings that are now housing. So I think it definitely could be part of a mix. I think you definitely probably don't need as much office space as we have in the city, and so it could be an important part of our housing mix. So we got another question from John. How can or does HPD directly help preservation groups like Historic Districts Council? We have similar goals, and you have lots more resources and are also fighting the fight. That's a great question. I would love to hear ideas about what support HDC needs. I think that often historic landmarking and especially historic districts can be in conflict with some of our city's goals around creating lots of new housing. I don't think it has to be that way. I think that we can preserve our history and create new housing. And so I would love to see HPD and HDC on the same sides of fights, and would love to hear ideas about what kind of support or collaboration you'd be interested in. So Victoria says that New York City's population has been decreasing before COVID. Has it changed? And if so, how has that changed HPD's goals? So my understanding of census data is that we are at an all-time high of population. We're heading towards 9 million. We did see people leave New York City during the pandemic, but it seems like they are cruising back. And so I will try to find a link to a nice primer on New York City's population changes. That I can pop in the chat. But I would say that HPD's approach hasn't changed. We are responding to the needs of New Yorkers generally in the types of housing that we create. New York City's population is both increasing and it's changing in terms of its composition. We have many more non-family households than we used to have. And so some of the changes that we're looking into are around the types of housing that we support and also the types of housing that can be built in New York City. Many of our zoning and housing rules are based on progressive era 1920s and 30s ideas about family structure. And so there's all sorts of rules embedded in our housing codes that kind of really promote housing for family households. But we have more single individuals in New York City than we've ever had before, and also all sorts of different household arrangements. And so we need a much more diverse housing stock than a city filled with 2 and 3 bedroom apartments. We need bigger apartments, we need smaller apartments. So yeah, I'm going to put a link to the city's kind of census webpage in the chat. But our population grew between 2010 and 2020 by about 600,000 people. Brandon, I'm not sure I understand the question. If you want to either come off mute and share it or say more in the chat. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think if I had my druthers, I'd make lots of changes to our zoning districts. I think especially our contextual districts, while they have important, height and setback rules, create a lot of sameness with the types of buildings that they promote. And they don't really promote the type of buildings that New Yorkers love. I think the city's contextual zoning districts, they have a max height and a max number of floors, and those are designed around 8-foot floor-to-floor heights, and start at the ground level. And so they don't allow for the types of design features that I think are iconic New York, like stoops, an elevated first floor that gets people's apartments out of being like right at sidewalk height. And yeah, in terms of less height and more lot coverage, why not more height and more lot coverage, I would say. But I do think that they were ripe for reform of our zoning districts. I guess while in the deafening silence here, I'll also note that other cities that I think are incredibly around the world that are, have high density housing and high levels of livability, are built where there are more areas of kind of medium height, thinking about places like Barcelona, which I think of as a very livable city, where it's sort of like all of the city is 8 stories, and you don't have places, where like New York City, I think over half of New York City is small homes, 1, 2 unit, 2-story homes. And then we have really dense areas. And I think having more in the middle, I'm a Jackson Heights resident. I think if like the whole city were built out at 5 stories like Jackson Heights, we have a ton more housing, and it would be very livable. But now I'm just philosophizing because I have an open mic and no one's asking more questions.
Are there any other questions? Doesn't seem like it. So again, if there are, you can always email me, MARBULU. And Michael just put his email in the chat as well. Thank you very much. So with that, I think we will say good night. As a reminder, this has been recorded. You can watch it on our YouTube channel along with all of our other programming. Again, we will have other preservation schools classes coming up, so please check out our website. And thank you very much, Michael. This was fantastic. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you for having me, and yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions.
Thank you.